in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast.
So it really is about you sitting back, figuring out what the context is, and then filling in the content to support that end goal.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by continuing guest host, Aaron Geiser. Today we're going to switch things up a little bit and answer some listener questions. Aaron, welcome back to the show.
What's up, Phil? It's good to be back, and I like the topic of today. It's giving back to our listeners.
Yeah, I always love all of the questions, and typically I answer most of them on Instagram and do an Instagram story with like my responses and other things like that. But you're really limited to about a minute, per response. So I think today is going to be really valuable for people, and hopefully encourage more questions to be asked, because Aaron and I are going to try to continually answer people's questions going forward. Maybe have a segment at the end of each show where we answer one or two questions, and kind of that's how we'll wrap up the show from now on. So if you do have any questions, this is kind of a call to action for you. DM me, DM Aaron, and we'll incorporate those into upcoming shows that we record. So yeah, I always get excited about this because I have a perception of what people want to know, and most of the time that perception, it might be a little bit off. So it's always good to kind of recalibrate and really just ask people, straight up, what do you want to know? So I think we can kind of dive in, and I'm sure, Aaron, if you think of any, questions that you get from athletes and those sort of things too, we can put them in. All of these questions
Are you going to extend this episode by about an hour and a half?
Oh man, yeah, this is definitely going to be a recurring sort of thing. Like, if we're going to try to answer questions at the end of each episode going forward, but we'll also do periodic ask the coach, sort of question and answers, because if one person is wondering, then probably a lot of other people are wondering about certain
Absolutely.
questions too. So we're going to start with an easy one. It's not an easy one. What is the most important factor for endurance development, volume or intensity?
It's such a delightful question, because the two do have their place going hand in hand. But if you have to choose one, like my personal thought and what I feel the research that I come across is endurance development over intensity. But you still don't. I mean, it's kind of hard. You still put that asterisk around it, because you don't want to just make, well, it's all that, because you still want to get that little bit exposure of other side of the coin.
Yeah, the easy answer is both, but the challenging question then is, how do we mix in enough volume and enough intensity to elicit all the adaptations that we're trying to gain, right? Because if you look at any coach, at least right now, any coach in our realm of history, they're not just prescribing volume. They're not prescribing intensity. So it's always a mixture. And that mixture is going to come down to, what point of the season are you in? What are you racing? Like, what is your actual outcome? And I think the way that I posed this question on Instagram, it was like, what do you want to know about triathlon, development? And we'll take it to the next step and say, more of long course triathlon. So if and this could then apply to people like marathoners, 150 to 100 mile cyclists, or half Ironman to Ironman, maybe even a little bit further. So from that perspective, does that give you a little bit better lens of maybe, where to go with it?
So, like, when I put on my coaching hat, the first question is, like, what is the limiter in that case? So what is preventing you from getting both volume and intensity in that case? And I think tackling that particular question is important, because maybe this individual is just coming about this from a very, very small scope and not expanding. Okay, well, if I can still put in, let's say that I have 75 minutes of time to give for that workout. Well, what if we gave 60 minutes to aerobic development, then
Hmm.
put a little bit of a 10-minute intensity block in the back portion of that workout, then follow it down with the 5-minute workout? We've met the 75 minutes that that individual had. We also hit duration and we also got a little bit of intensity there. So
Hmm.
I still don't think, even in the sense of, is it one or the other? You can still kind of mingle the two together in the right way to still scratch each itch. And I
Hmm.
feel like seeing what the hesitation or seeing what the restriction might be, and then evolving that thought to, here's how I would still give you both of these parameters or
Hmm.
both of these options within the single element, to allow it to mix and match what you have from a time and availability standpoint.
Yeah, I that was said like a true coach. I think is, well, the first thing we need to do is we need to figure out from an individual perspective, how much are they willing, or how much do they have available? And let's be realistic about it, right? Because, you know, we talked about, like the challenges with trying to be like an elite level athlete and saying like, oh, I'm going to train 20 to 30 hours per week. It's like, well, is that actually realistic? Because if you have to wake up every morning at 5 a.m., or might be 4 a.m. if you're trying to do like 2 or 3 hours worth of workouts before you then help your kids your kids get ready for school, take them to school, go to work all day, come back, you're going to burn the candles at both ends. So I think that's the number one important thing, right? Is how much time do you have to develop that uh endurance for whatever sport and whatever outcome it is. And then, yeah, how do we then partition those days to maybe mix in some high intensity stuff? And I think there's a lot of people who are really scared of putting higher intensity work within their lower intensity endurance development, because there's this misconception that, oh, if I do 60 minutes of zone 2 training and then follow it up with like strides or sprints or uh I don't know, any sort of, high intensity stuff at the end, it's essentially going to wipe out all of those adaptations that I just developed for 60 minutes. So, could you speak on that a little bit? Like, if I were an athlete and I was like worried, what would you tell me?
So it's, and this is a common question that I get on my Saturday Zwift ride, because I do try to keep it somewhat engaging while still trying to get the predominant physiological response that we want to. And I
Hmm.
might just drop in a couple of maybe 12-second efforts, or at the back end, do some 30-30s from intensity. And I get this question quite a bit. And it's really, one, what we don't want to do is completely cross over from a oxidative workout to a anaerobic, and that's going to partially be the amount of time that we have exposed within those energy systems and how we're calling upon those energy
Hmm.
systems. But again, if we segment these workouts to not extend the amount of time that we're in that anaerobic state, we're still going to get those oxidative states or aerobic benefits from the workout. So
Hmm.
how I would recommend that is get the majority of the workout. So let's say that I should back up and say, what's the main goal that you want to accomplish with this workout? And then put the main focus of that workout early to get that box checked. And
Hmm.
then you can kind of come behind that and throw in some of these other alternatives to get other physiological benefits. But when you still look back, yeah, you can check both the boxes that you got it off, but the
Hmm.
predominant reason you were in that session was the primary focus of the early part of that workout. So I look at as the athlete is making a great point. And if you mix this into a mixed bag and shake that bag up, yes, you have a chance of not hitting the right benefit that you're shooting for. So
Mm-hmm.
first, ask the question, what is the benefit of this workout?
Mm-hmm.
Do I want it to be more a higher intensity workout, or do I want it to be more of a lower intensity workout? Then implement the predominant force of that workout to hit that target and goal. And then you can sprinkle in some of those other areas along with it to get the additional benefits that you're shooting to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is, it's like what you need to do is whatever your focus is, you need to put that first in the workout. And that's, if you've ever been in the strength training world, or like the, kind of hybrid athlete sort of world, everyone always asks the question, should I do endurance first or should I do strength training first? And what's the most beneficial? And the answer is, again, it depends. It depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to develop endurance, then you should probably do that endurance first, and then recognize that your strength training is going to take a little bit of a hit. And this is assuming that you're going to do it back to back. Maybe you don't have that much time, in between. In an ideal world, you'd space things out, right? And you'd have, like a dedicated volume day, you'd have a dedicated intensity day, and maybe you'd follow, maybe, say for example, if you had 5 days a week to work out, you do one hard workout and then maybe 4 easier workouts. But if you want to spread that hard work over the course of maybe 2 days, get a little bit more frequency within that, then you could break that super hard day into 2 a little bit less, hard, and append it to a little bit more of like the volume sort of days. So, there's 8 million different ways to go about it. I think ultimately what we see is that volume, especially done in an easy or relaxed way, allows us to accumulate, or I guess, yeah, the easy volume allows us to accumulate more volume. More volume allows more time on the feet or in the saddle, and that is extremely important for these longer races. And that's why you see, like I said, don't compare yourself to elite level athletes, but that's why you see Tour de France athletes, they log 20 to 30,000 miles a year of riding. But just know that they're also doing high intensity work too, to sharpen, that blade, to hone themselves in order to be able to get their full potential out. So you really need both.
Well, and I think that this is kind of where this thought process that was initially taught to me by Paul Larson, and then I think it kind of was Martin Bouchette, and both of those guys kind of really push content over content, or context over content. So
Mm-hmm.
we want to set up the context and then put in the content to meet the context. So really finding out what you want to accomplish. And then it just takes that specificity. It does take a little bit more time and effort, but it's almost like, what do I want to accomplish? Okay, here's what I need to apply to that to accomplish that task. So it really is about you sitting back, figuring out what the context is, and then filling in the content
Mm-hmm.
to support that end goal.
Yep. Yeah. So it's not as simple. And if you go and read the literature, you'll see that you gain different adaptations from more volume. You gain different adaptations from more intensity, and from, I'll just talk from a mitochondrial perspective. What we see generally is that more of that long, slower distance, that zone 2 training, that volume building training, is going to result in more capillary density, more mitochondrial volume. So your mitochondria actually get bigger within your muscle. A more fatigue resistant phenotype, in a sense, at the low end, while that high intensity stuff is going to favor mitochondrial functional adaptation. So your mitochondria's ability to use oxygen. And this is why we need both of them, because they are triggering different adaptations. So if you're only doing one thing, then you're essentially missing out on some of the other possible adaptations that you could stand to make if you mix everything up appropriately, right? If you follow that context first, what are my goals? What's the race that I'm trying to do? What am I trying to develop? And then you fill in that content in order to push those goals forward.
And I think pushing it out to everybody's like, look at the job that you have as a professional. Most of the time you have multiple things that you are working on in one day. But if your boss comes to you that day and says, okay, the next 6 months, this is all you're going to do. This is all you're going to do. You're going to get really good at that one task. But all these other things that you might have capabilities of doing are going to fall down. They're going to not be as sharp. Doesn't mean that we can't bring them back up over time, but they are going to become less utilized and less sharp in that case. Mm-hmm. So in that, we like to expose you to multiple work so you bring more to the table from a business side of things. It's the same thing with your body. If you address more of these styles of training, your body and your physiology is going to be more like, it's going to adapt quicker to it, but it also is going to be able to withstand and sustain and grow by the exposure that you're providing to it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And we've talked about this on the podcast numerous times. It's like, in the off season, everything like that, you can be a little bit more general in terms of your training. So maybe focus a little bit more on like those physiological adaptations that you're trying to make that aren't super specific to the sport. But then as you get closer to that race, you start to get more specific as to, what is it that race is going to demand of you. And, then you can start to really hone in on those specific things. And it's all adjusting the levers and the dials, right? The different dimmer switches for the different frequencies, and, tuning that to reach whatever it is that context, that goal is, ultimately.
Yeah, it's all about pulling the right levers.
Mm-hmm. There we go. Okay, I think that was a really good overview of volume versus intensity, and I think we kind of touched on this, but maybe we can just go into more specifics for this listener. How should you periodize a very long training cycle? So they said 11 to 12 months for someone who has one goal race per year, and we've definitely talked about this on the show, but I think. And I literally just kind of touched on it, but I think we can give some succinct, action items for this individual.
So what I start with is I like to build backwards. So you have the event. You're most likely, if you're talking about that you're spending 12 months to get prepared for this event, you're going to want to taper. I mean, you want to be peaking in this case. So you'll put in your taper. Now, tapers can be a complicated question. Some people like 1 week, some people like 10 days, some people like 2 weeks. So I'm not going to give the specificity of what you should do because I just don't think that there is a right answer to that. But building that taper out from the event, then leading into that taper, you want to have a competition event where things are super, super specific. You want to hold race power for longer periods of time. You want to emulate some of the course dynamics that you are going to be competing against, whether there be hills, whether there be flats. If it's swimming, you want to try, if you're doing an open water ocean swim, it's going to be a little bit of a different mix up than if you were doing an ocean water or open water lake swim. Is it a downstream? So these things you need to start incorporating into that competition phase. The competition phase is really, really, really key and specific to what you're going to be racing towards and what you want to try to hold for that race. Now,
how long do you typically do for like a specific phase, like different mesocycles, I guess?
So based on a couple of parameters, like in this sense, it was 12 months. I would tend to not go less than 6 weeks in this time frame. Okay. I would probably be closer to 8, but also we still have to recognize what type of individual this is. Are they prone to breakdown for extended, like if they have extended period of high volume and intensity in this case? So
Mm-hmm.
if that is the case, maybe I would end up doing a 4 week competition phase, 1 week down, 4 week competition phase. So that block ends up turning into a 9 week block
Mm-hmm.
or 9 week cycle with two 4 week meso blocks with a single, like, not I mean, we don't want to jump off, but maybe a 75 to 60% decrease in volume and intensity just to absorb the training that you're doing
Mm-hmm.
and then get prepared for that final lift off into that next 4 week block.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking at a 12, then I wouldn't make it more than 4 weeks, Phil.
If you're looking at a 12.
Week instead of a 12 month. So if you're
Oh,
looking at a
okay. Yeah.
build as 12 weeks, I would almost break it down into three, like 3 or 4 week cycles with,
Yeah.
depending on how long your taper is going to be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so then you have the specific or the competition phase, and then what's before that? So if we're still
So
building
what
backwards.
what we call that at Endure IQ is the specific phase. So we are starting to get more specificity. It just is a little bit shorter in the duration. So we go general base, specific, and competition phase. And
Okay.
the competition phase is still extremely specific, but the
Mm-hmm.
specific phase is more starting to introduce specific aspects to the process for development. So
Yeah.
where we might want to start to hold 20 or raise power for 20 or 30 minutes, this phase we start to expose it maybe an 8, or we start doing a 3-8-4 model, or we just start to build up that specificity
Mm-hmm.
at time of what we're going to hold for that competition phase.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because and we were just talking about volume and intensity, right? And it kind of the way that you're talking about this is exactly like what we were saying is like the funnel effect, right? You're starting that build phase, and your build phase, I mean, if you're thinking 8 weeks for a competition phase, another maybe 8 weeks for a specific phase,
And again, I want to
then
reiterate, with the way that this was presented in a 12-month,
yes.
again, I want to make sure that we're clear with our audience that we are doing these blocks a little bit longer based on the amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
And we're also going to spend more time in that general base development phase because we want a robust system that can handle these, what we've now put together as 16 weeks of higher intensity workouts. Your body's going to be able to sustain that a lot more healthily than if we tried to do that 16 weeks after maybe just a 4 or even an 8 week progression in the general phase.
Mm-hmm.
So please, I'm sorry I cut you off there, Phil, but I just
No.
wanted to make sure that we kind of specified that this is dedicated to kind of that 12-month,
Yeah.
not 12-week lead into this A race.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a great distinction because, then we say, okay, so if it's 6 to 8 weeks for a competition phase and we're building backwards, right? So 1 to 3 weeks for a taper, 6 to 8 weeks for your competition phase, 6 to 8 weeks for that build or that specific building phase, and then the rest of it is really just maybe you start with a little bit of an off season, but then you're doing a lot of general base building, right? Especially for long course sort of stuff. That's trying to build volume, maybe develop your VO2 max, do those things that aren't actually specific to your longer race, because you'll be able to hone that in during those specific and competition phases, right?
And
Go
how
ahead.
I kind of address the general phase is we're trying to elevate your ceilings. We're
Mm-hmm.
trying to improve the opportunity for growth. And if we do a good job in that phase. When we get into the specific and the competition phase, we are going to be much more able to, one, sustain the load, but two, we're going to build the fitness and really design a successful, I don't know why we and I got a thumbs up. I don't know what's going the new Apple, I think, operating system, every now and then when I do hand gestures, it either sends balloons or gives thumbs up. So I was talking with my hands a little bit there, and we got some balloons flying. So sorry about that if you're on the video part of this. But
No, it's entertaining.
the but if we elevate your ceiling during the general phase, you're going to be able to more sustain some of these. One, we're going to hopefully have a little bit of higher wattage, better pacing with a little more heart rate control when we get to that specific phase. Then, when we start to extend that out, we really, when we get to the competition phase, where I want to see is that heart rate start to come down and settle into where we want it to be in the race environment, while we're holding and sustaining that power or pace for longer periods of time. So often for me, Phil, when I take an athlete into the specific phase, in the early phases of the specific phase, we are in, of course, the aerobic, we're still focused on heart rate training. We are trying to maintain a low level of stress. But when we go into some of these higher intense workouts or just getting the exposure, what I want to start to do is build towards the pacing structure or the watt structure that that athlete wants to get the outcome that we have talked about for their results. So early on in that phase, I am most likely going to see heart rates that are well above their race pace efforts. And early on, I'm okay with this. One, that does, you need to understand that that's going to create a greater amount of stress on the body, but we're holding it for a shorter period of time. But what we are trying to accomplish is the closer that we get to that event, the more specific the training gets. We want to start to see the heart rate start to adapt to those exposures and start to really maintain steady state and controlled heart rate levels, but it's matching up really, really close with that pacing structure that we had for that athlete that we're trying to shoot for within the race. But early in that specific phase, we might see that power pace structure here and that heart rate a little bit elevated. That to me is fine. That's what we expect to see. Over the course of time, the more exposure that we have, the longer we build out those sets, I want to see that heart rate start to drip back down and come back into a line where we are shooting for to race from that heart rate structure and that pacing structure. So there's a couple of different ways from the athlete perspective is I don't want you to walk into this phase, see your heart rate really elevated because you're really just exposing yourself to this style of higher intensity workout and say, ooh, I got to back off and then move it back down to almost like a zone two or an aerobic base, because then you're not actually providing the opportunity or the specificity to improve physiologically to get you prepared for the event that you're moving towards.
Yeah, I love that approach to things, and it's more it's more nuanced than just, oh, we progress from here to here to here and it's always going to be this linear transition and stuff. It's like, no, there's definitely going to be times, especially at the beginning of that specific phase, where your heart rate is going to be way higher than what we would hope for, say, during the race. But that's the whole point of doing more of that specific work. You get more efficient at it, probably from both a physiological and a mechanical standpoint. Heat tolerance is going to play into that, right? Because you're going to be generating a lot of heat. So your body's probably going to be adapting to how it's tolerating the generation of that heat at those higher but moderate intensities that you're going to see, on race day. And by progressing that over time you're going to then see that fitness level or that internal stress come down because your body is actually going to adapt. And this is actually a perfect juxtaposition into the next question, which is, can you use watt-based training, or should you use internal variables like heart rate and lactate to modulate your training? And I think you touched on this perfectly. I'll start by giving what my thoughts are. Is, in the beginning of the year, when you're doing your general preparatory phase, you know, mostly you're going to want to kind of gauge your internal stress, especially at that low end, that zone 2 sort of stuff, based off of heart rate. And you're going to want to really control it based on the internal stress that you're feeling. VO2 max work and high intensity work's a little bit different, just because heart rate does take time to level out. So, for example, if you're like, oh, I'm going to do VO2 max work and it only starts after I get to a heart rate of 90% of my maximum heart rate, you're going to spend a lot of time getting up to that 90%, and it is going to be absolutely brutal, to try to maintain that. So that's where, at least in the general preparatory phase, wattage or pacing plays a big role, because you're just trying to accumulate time at that high intensity, and then internal response or internal stress will follow from that output. Whereas with the lower training, you're going to want to do heart rate and then modulate wattage and pacing accordingly. Then as you start to get closer to the race, you start to get an idea, okay, what are my goals and what are my realistic outputs on race day? And you're going to say, okay, if I'm actually racing this race, the only thing that matters is how fast you get across the finish line. And so if you know where your fitness is going, then you should be able to tune in, what power output should I be able to hold for, the Ironman bike, right? And from there, you can, in the beginning of the specific phase, you can start to, do exactly what you're talking about. Maybe you're doing 30 minutes at Ironman race pace. Your heart rate is probably going to be a little higher, because this is a new stress for you. Your body needs to adapt to it, but you're not going to modulate your wattage down. You're going to maintain that wattage. And then you're going to just be aware that, oh, that was more of an internal stress on my body, so I probably need to try to recover a little bit better accordingly. So in the beginning, you're kind of, focused on those internal variables. Whereas, kind of as you get more and more specific and close towards that race, you're going to be a little bit more aware of the output variables, the wattage, the speed. And that's my take on it, is it's a bit of a transition point.
And I agree with that 100%, Phil. I think the only thing that we could add to it is you can there are enough gadgets and gizmos out there now that you can implement and start to see crossovers where my muscle oxygenation is to where my heart rate is or where my watts are.
Mm-hmm.
You can add all of these things, but it takes the time to actually analyze them and correlate them between. If you want to simplify the process, as you talked about, 100% early in the season, follow heart rate, and in VO2 max, it would be more of a like an actual output number rather than trying to measure heart rate, because it does take 2.5 to 3 minutes to get steady state heart rate. If you're trying to accomplish a heart rate in 30 seconds, it's just not physically, the demand and the response is not realistic in that case.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're trying to make this easier on yourself, look at as little of things as possible and follow Phil's recommendations. Now, if you are a person that likes to add your gadgets, then the key would be to actually analyze those. If you're just attaching them to yourself to be cool or to think that you're doing it like somebody else is doing it, you're better off saving your money or doing something else, because if you're not looking at the data, if you're not analyzing it, it doesn't matter. So if I always like to say, if we're going to bring these particular things into the environment, it's important that we make sure that we start to read and associate them with things that we see within other workouts. And again, we're taking more sample sizes. We're not just taking lactate from one workout and saying, okay, well, your heart rate was here at this millimolar. We're going to continue to always hit that point. I think all of these things, it's more important if you're going to add them that you add them for a longer period of time, because
Mm-hmm.
they are going to start to bring that data into a smaller point, where if you just do it one, your margin of error is really, really large. Maybe you got it right, Phil, right that first time. Would you agree? And then when you span past that, maybe you didn't come close.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe you were super recovered one day, and like for example, I've been doing repeated exercise physiology testing with the new Moxie Trainalized remote physiology stuff, and one test, my maximal lactate steady state that was calculated was 20 watts higher than another test. That's not because the test is just inherently wrong. It's because one day I was feeling myself and pretty recovered. And then another day, I had changed up the protocol a little bit, done a few other things, and I was like pretty tired. So I now have a range. So now what's going to happen is, as I continue to do more and more tests, right, that range should tighten up, or that variance should tighten up, and it should give me an idea. Okay, well, if I start to identify how I'm responding on a 4-week basis, then I can start to say, okay, well, when I'm really recovered, this is probably what my limit is. When I'm not really recovered, this is probably what my limit is. And then, so I think we've said it on the podcast before, but like, data is useless unless you actually can get actionable, direction out of it. So, it could be as simple as just, heart rate in the beginning of the season, followed by, more wattage and speed towards the specific phase. Or it could be as complicated as, oh, well, I'm taking lactate values during my zone 2 work, and I'm calibrating that based on how much food I ate, based on how hydrated I am. I'm doing SMO2 measures every single day. That's another thing I've been playing around with, is doing an SMO2 warm up where I do a step test every single day, where I hit like 5 different steps, and I have SMO2, heart rate, and power output. And then I'm coming up with a bit of an equation to give me a performance index, and I'm seeing how that shifts based on how tired I am, based on what I did the day before. And again, all of that would be useless unless unless I had an outcome that I was trying to detect, right? Because at the end of the day, for me, that is something that, if I could do a step test that's not too hard, it does get a little bit above threshold at the very end, but then you stop. But if I could have something that kind of tells me my readiness, at least from an internal and an external response, that gives me a little bit more direction. And I think it would be valuable for individuals who are self-coached, to give you a check. What is your body saying? And, as opposed to, is like, it's like, if you have a coach, your coach is going to give you a decision tree, with workouts and stuff like that. But yeah, I would say the technology and everything is as complicated as you want to make it. If you're willing to analyze all the data and make those connections, then it's great. If not, don't measure it, because it's just going to get in the way of you developing yourself even better.
And being consistent with the review. It's not something
Mm-hmm.
where either you're looking at that output under the same microscope.
Mm-hmm.
It's always a VO2 max, or it's always an endurance, or you look at all of the workouts, but don't look at them sporadically, because then
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to get actionable information as well. So, again, there are ways that we can make this really, really complicated and really make it precise and really push the needle of development.
Mm-hmm.
But again, as we're saying, if one, you don't have the time, if two, you don't have the understanding, three, you just don't get the material, don't apply it, because it's just going to be nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
If you have all those factors and you can bring it together and make controlled decisions off of that information, that's where it really becomes a big benefit and an opportunity to really push your fitness to another level. But it takes all of that preciseness to get to that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. So just be cautious with the technology that you're implementing, because it can really, I think, confuse a lot of people. And this is where uh, I, I'm not against using lactate values, but I think the way that it's taught to a lot of people is way oversimplified, and then people kind of lose the nuance and aren't fully understanding it, so they're making decisions based on gaps in knowledge, and I think it could send people down the wrong rabbit holes.
Well, and you and I both are aware it's not the matter of pricking your finger and taking a sample. It's got to be a clean sample, and
Mm-hmm.
what we mean by that is you don't want to get sweat within that sample because it's going to throw the numbers off dramatically. And
Mm-hmm.
if you don't get a good sample and you go with that number, it's going to throw off every, like, the data leading up to that. It's going to throw off, it's going to throw that data, and it could
Mm-hmm.
throw off the steps after that data. The other thing that I'm not a huge fan about, it's just so daggone expensive. And I think that it's been it's been so exposed on certain YouTubes that people don't always associate that with the actual cost that it takes to get the
Mm-hmm.
information that you need. And to give, I don't have a box of them in this room anymore, but a box of 25 test strips is 56, $76, depending on what type you want.
Yeah.
You're looking at most, I mean, if you're going into a session, you probably don't want to take less than five.
Yeah.
And you're probably taking closer to 10 to 15 samples during that. I mean, you're talking
That's
about
a $45.
just that one workout ended up costing about 25 to $30.
Yeah.
And your job is not done because you only got one day of sampling there. You
Mm-hmm.
need to do that multiple days. It ends up turning out to be a very, very costly experiment. And then you factor in some of the things that you talked about, Phil, where if there's gaps in the knowledge and we're also then factoring in poor tests, it can really send you down a expensive, like, science project and not give you any data if you do it the wrong way.
Yeah, it won't give you too many answers. And I mean, you have to think about, are you in a fasted or fed condition, because that's going to change your numbers. You have to think about, are you fatigued, are you hydrated? There's so many factors that actually play into the accumulation of lactate within the blood. And I've been talking quite a bit about, or something that I'm trying to do a little bit better on my Instagram is give people explanations of what are certain measures actually giving us, and what are all the inputs that are affecting that measure, right? And then what can we actually glean from it? So if you are interested in learning more, there's probably a number of them posted by this point. So go check them out. If you do have questions about it, I'm more than happy to talk about it. It's not that you shouldn't be measuring lactate if you're super interested in it. Just know that there are challenges with it, from a monetary standpoint, from a nutritional standpoint, from a fatigue related standpoint. All of these different factors are going to play into it. So
Stress due to the workouts of that week,
yes.
stress due to sleep, stress due to the family. These lists go on and on. So,
Mm-hmm.
again, as we kind of talked about a moment ago, leading into the lactate point of this, is you got to analyze all that stuff if you're going to take it into account. And if you
Mm-hmm.
don't, you're going to end up with a lot less answers than you fully expect.
Yep. Or the answers that you have are going to lead you in the wrong direction, because you don't get the full picture, which is you definitely don't want to do that. So actually that's kind of like the speaking of the stresses of like what affects lactate and other things like that. We talked a little bit about the fasted and fed condition. So another question that came up is, can easy long running or easy riding on an empty stomach increase the body's fat burning ability? And is that dependent on fasted versus fed condition?
So this is one of the areas that I do get athletes coming to me specifically, and I have taken a lot of athletes through kind of improve fat oxidation rates. And
Mm-hmm.
the simplistic answer, and of course we wouldn't be good scientists if we just said yes or no. It
Right.
yes, it can improve, but there are things around that can sculpt the answer a little bit more defined. And
Mm-hmm.
the the simplistic answer is it can improve fat oxidation and improve your ability to burn fat. And then you can also improve that fat burning at higher intensity levels. The
Mm-hmm.
better you, or the more you expose yourself to that, and the better that you get at it. So that's one. The other thing, the negatives behind it is where if we go prolonged periods of time without putting calories back into our body, we could go into a significant caloric deficit. And in this,
Mm-hmm.
that's where hormones start to end up being thrown off and can really throw a whole nother bag of challenges onto that fire. And so that's why I don't like just saying the simple yes. There
Mm-hmm.
are other things. And we've done some exposure to athletes going into a workout into a fasted state, a carb fueled state, and then a protein and fat fueled state.
Mm-hmm.
And what we have found is that the fueling in a fat and protein state, one, provides the body calories, but two, it does not necessarily change that ability to oxidize fat at the same level as being fasted.
Mm-hmm.
So we almost lean towards going towards that model because you're putting the calories in your body. You're not getting that negative setup or having to catch back up,
Right.
and it sets you up for a lot more success. The one thing that we have noticed is when you add carbohydrates to the system, and especially depending on the type of carbohydrate, this can challenge your fat oxidation ability and
Mm-hmm.
improve and decrease your ability to improve that. So, the one thing that we often teach, and I specifically teach, is depending on the workout, but most workouts, I have the athlete going in a slightly carb depleted state. So that means that meal before we're not necessarily taking in carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
And what that's going to allow us to do is move that fat oxidation number, open up that metabolic pathway for lipids and just the utilization of fat to fuel the early portion of that workout. And then if you need to start to, whether it be your limitation or we start to throw in higher intensity efforts, we then input carbohydrates in those to
Mm-hmm.
fuel that portion of the workout. But the simplistic answer back is yes, you can improve fat oxidation by training on an empty stomach state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this is, kind of we talk a lot about, like what does the research say versus what is actually practical. And you touched on something really, really perfect is like, yes, if you exercise in a fasted state, you're most likely you're going to improve your fat oxidation over if you trained in a carbohydrate fed state or just a fed state in general. However, the downsides to training in a fasted state, and this is where maybe you're getting marginal gains in terms of if you feed with, say, fats and protein versus if you did something fasted, is that you're going to accumulate a calorie deficit. And accumulating a calorie deficit is going to be a harder and harder stress on your body. So you're going to accumulate more internal stress, right? Because you're going to be depleting some level of glycogen because you're always using carbohydrates, almost always using carbohydrates. um, and that's going to dig you a deeper and deeper hole. You're probably not going to then, like you're going to be playing catch up, throughout the day. So you really have to be careful and you have to be mindful of what you're doing and what the outcome is. Exactly like what you were saying, right? Is we have to put content or context first and then, put the content within it. So, the way that Aaron thinks about this is very nuanced, right? He said, well, we realized that going in and doing fasted cardio was probably not the best way for athletes because they were, experiencing too much stress, too much calorie deficit. So what we decided to do is have an athlete take fats and proteins because, from a physiological perspective, your body is going to oxidize what it is given. So we see this with mice all the time. If you feed a mouse a high fat diet, not if you give a mouse a cookie, but if you feed a mouse a high fat diet, they're going to actually preferentially oxidize fat. And that's the adaptation, because your body is given fat, your body is going to adapt to oxidize that fat. If you're giving your body carbohydrate, you're going to preferentially burn carbohydrates. So the way that Aaron goes about it, and I'm just trying to be very clear with like the protocol, is you can go in, say you wake up in the morning, you're already kind of in a semi-fasted, maybe a little bit of a liver glycogen depleted state. You go into your workout. Maybe you have, some protein and some peanut butter, or some peanut butter would be good because that's a mixture of fats and proteins. And then you add a little bit more protein or something along those lines. Then, if you, depending on your intensity and other things like that, you're taking in something else that's, maybe a little bit more mixture of, the fats and proteins. But if you're extending that workout out longer, then you can start to take in carbohydrates, because, it's exactly like the volume versus intensity, sort of spiel that you gave is, what's the focus? In the beginning of the workout, we're going to try to extend fat oxidation for as long as possible, because that's going to stimulate fat adaptation pathways, because we're stressing that entire system. By stressing that entire system, whatever the limiting factor, hopefully, is going to be upregulated. And, then from there, you're going to get better at fat oxidation. But then, towards the back half of that workout, it's like, okay, we're probably depleting quite a bit of glycogen and, in carbohydrates. So we're going to need to at least get on top of that a little bit to minimize the amount of glycogen depletion. Because if you're always running on, on low glycogen stores, uh, I think there's good literature to support that you can have, some weird immune, like immune suppression. You're essentially stressing yourself out a little bit more. So you just have to be careful. But yes, I think again, it's like it comes down to context and then content, and thinking it from that perspective.
And I recognize that question was very, very general, but
Mm-hmm.
things that need to be kind of assessed when leading into that. How long is the duration of that workout? What are my next workouts? What are my actual mental demands after that workout? All of these things are important factors to play into your decision making and how you're going to fuel prior and during that
Mm-hmm.
session. Now, or and I should probably say after that session too, because you want to need to replenish what you probably utilized through that session. So taking the time, it's becoming more of a headsy athlete in this case, and just realizing and taking account of what other things that you have going on, what things that you want to accomplish within that workout, and how you want to be able to operate behind that too. Because
Mm-hmm.
as you said, it's if we are decreasing our glycogen stores, that's going to directly affect the workout that we might have either right after that workout or in the PM of that day.
Mm-hmm.
So these things just need to be tracked and have a plan set up that, okay, you can still refuel protein and fat and have that lead you into that workout, but it's probably good to at least provide yourself a bit of carbohydrate to prepare you for and in maybe a higher intensity session later on that day, or even
Mm-hmm.
another aerobic session. You can probably up the fat and protein in that case again, but still putting in a little bit of carbohydrate to the system, because again, if we are consistently training in a low stored glycogen state, our body is going to start producing ketones. The problem with this over time is the body starts to decrease the amount of ketones that it does produce on its own when you've had that lengthy exposure. So, what you might be experiencing now in a low carb or even keto state might be that mental clarity of ketones in your body and being utilized as an energy source. But over time, with extended exposure to that lifestyle, that ketone level of beta hydroxybutyrate does decrease over the time. And you might not find that that same mental clarity or that same energy level is consistent through the course of the day.
Well, so my question is your body actually down regulating ketone production, or are we just getting better at utilizing those ketones within the blood, kind of like lactate, right, accumulation within the blood? So
True.
knowing what you're measuring, that's just like a syntax sort of argument, which we don't need to really go into. But at the same time, I think something that we also have to address is this idea of a calorie deficit. And if you're training for something and you're always in a calorie deficit, then you run the risk of starting to uh, I'll call it self cannibalization. But what you're going to do is, say you had a brick building, and it's like you're trying to build that brick building higher, but you're not supplying enough bricks to continue to build that. So you start taking bricks from the bottom and you start stacking them on top, and then all of a sudden you get all these holes in your foundation. And you find that, okay, well, maybe I am improving for a little while, because you're still building you're still building that building higher. The problem is that's becoming more and more of this collapsible Jenga tower. So that's actually a perfect transition into our last question that we'll answer for the day: is how important is body weight as a long course triathlete, and what's the ideal body fat percentage? My opinion on this is that the training is more important than okay, it depends, because if you have somebody who is overweight, obese, that could that has excessive amounts of body fat, then it's probably a good idea to do a little bit of body recomposition, so being in a calorie deficit. But you have to recognize that by being in that calorie deficit, you're going to limit your body's ability to adapt to training and build your performance. So you're going to have to be okay with your performance kind of staying stagnant as body weight comes down. But if that's the first thing you need to do, then that's what you need to focus on, if that's going to ultimately lead to health. But I think if you're really training for performance, you have to be really careful about when you try to like lose some body weight, or whatever it is. And ideal body fat percentage, I think, as long as you're kind of within that like healthy like range of body fat percentages, you're going to set yourself up for the best ability to continue to stay consistent, stay healthy, be able to do your training. And that's what's going to make the most impact on how well you actually do on race day. Obviously, as you get more and more elite, you'll find that athletes are leaner and leaner. But I don't think that's because they're making uh, they're not making the conscious effort to say, I'm going to lean out and be as lean as possible. That's a product of their training and of their continued training and their nutritional habits and their sleep habits and all of these other things that you may not see, from the outcomes.
One of my favorite things with triathlon right now is the diversity of the athlete that is being successful right now.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is, you just touched on, yes, they might get, like, some might get leaner, the product of the type of training that they're doing. But right now we are seeing such a variety of athletes across both male and female fields, and not only just in the age group, but I'm even looking at the professional side of it. You are seeing different body types have success in this sport.
Mm-hmm.
So I really feel like that is it is a potential thing that can get overlooked, but I see it and I think it's valuable because it prevents some form of body shaming in this sport. And
Mm-hmm.
the fact that we can have individuals of these different body types go out and win 70.3 distance or full distance Ironman, and and again, that's on both the men and female side. I find that that is just a marvelous thing
Mm-hmm.
because it also reiterates that probably there is no such thing as the ideal body weight or body percentage to
Mm-hmm.
be successful within the sport. I feel like they fall within the range, as you said, they fall within that healthy range. Some of them
Mm-hmm.
might even go in the lower half and they might perform worse.
Mm-hmm.
But I look at when I am asked this question by athletes, I am more basing it upon one, how are you feeling? How are you reacting to your family? Like if you're barking at your family or you can't take stressing, you probably are undernourished in that case.
Mm-hmm.
How are your outputs within your workout and how are you recovering? All of
Yeah.
these things factor into me answering that question. And it's still not based on weight. It's more based on the assessments of all these other factors. And that tends to make me gravitate towards, okay, well, here maybe is where our weight is. Now, I do have a couple of athletes that we do manage weight, but the reason why we manage weight is that we have recognized that there is either mood swings or other things that take place. Output goes down, sleep is worse, can't deal with certain stressors through the course of the day. And this is fluctuation up or down in that weight. But
Mm-hmm.
for these particular individuals, those are the ones that I'm paying attention to weight for. But for the most part, it's not something that I'm paying a great deal of attention to from day to day, unless, hey, I'm seeing a big, like, one, your heart rate's going up, your HRV is coming down, the outputs within your workouts are not hitting the level that we want. We need to start analyzing some other things. So, one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that I'll have them back up is, okay, let's start taking body weight for the next couple of days, see where we're at, see where it is from our previous trends,
Mm-hmm.
and then implement that. But I I mean, when people ask me that question, I don't answer it because I'll tell you what, Phil, I can't even tell you the last time that I weighed myself
Mm-hmm.
because I don't value that as an indicator of me racing well. It's all
Yeah.
of these other factors.
Yeah. I I love that approach to it. And it's like, if your performance is going up, like but for all intents and purposes, are you swimming faster? Are you biking faster? Are you running faster? Who gives a shit? Like
Yeah.
what your weight is, right? If your performance is going up, you're recovering well and you're able to progress over time and you're not getting sick constantly, then, that should be the metric rather than, oh, do I need to get down to a certain weight or do I need to change, like like, do I need to be as ripped as some of the individuals that I see exercising? And it's one of those things where I've struggled with this sort of thing time and time again. And when I chase body weight, I have a tendency to get injured. Whereas when I chase performance by fueling correctly and eating enough, that's actually where my body composition and my body weight and everything actually tends to get the best. So I would use it as that. And I've been doing a little bit of recalibrating just to see, okay, am I eating enough? Because that's always been my issue is like when I get stressed, I don't eat enough, from a protein perspective, maybe from a carbohydrate perspective. I'm doing quite a bit of high intensity, sort of work and other things like that. So I'm like, okay, I got to probably feel a little bit better. So I've been weighing myself, consistently day to day to day. And I mean, Aaron and I have been, going back and forth with like our workouts and stuff. And like, when I compare myself to where I was even a month ago, I am so much stronger and so much faster. And I contribute or attribute that to, fueling correctly, during my workouts and not running a calorie deficit all the time. So yeah, I think that's what I would focus on.
And like one of the things that you said, I would say fuel. You said something about fueling around workouts. I think it's just overall fueling through the course of the day.
Mm-hmm.
But I really, I really truly believe that these other management or almost, I do have a number of my athletes send me a daily wellness measure. So, how they woke up, muscles, were they sore, moving around? How was your mood? How did you feel as of your training yesterday? How was your
Mm-hmm.
nutrition? So I have this kind of wellness. I think it's got 10 to 12 questions depending on the athlete. And I have them answer those questions and send them over through today's plan. It allows me to kind of assess and look. And what that has allowed me to do is also measure some of their subjective and objective measures through that person and that athlete's day. So
Mm-hmm.
I feel like not only just looking at your workouts, but looking at the people that you're interacting with. If you're, and I think I joked about this, but with you on another podcast or before the podcast, but Dan always says if you've met three bastards in a day, something's wrong. So,
Yeah.
one of the things we can start with is looking at nutrition in that case. If everybody is irritating you, you're probably in a calorie deficit or you're overly tired. And
Mm-hmm.
if you're overly tired, we need to assess why. Is it because of a calorie deficit or is it
Mm-hmm.
because the work too hard? But um, with that, it's, I just feel like your motivation, your how you're connecting with other people, how you are feeling, all of these things factor into that over the ideal race weight. And if you're checking the box positively on all of these other measures, like you said, from a weight standpoint, who cares?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I distinctly, have this memory in my mind, and we'll leave you guys with this one. But, I've always been of the mindset, and, probably inappropriately so, that like, the lighter I was, the faster I was going to be. I got, you know, 9.5 hours into my Ironman. I think we were on the run at some point, and this lady who was like 5'5" and what I deemed as a little bit, like carrying a little bit excess body fat, went cruising by me. Did not see her, like the end, the rest of the day. I think she ended like, because I looked at her number and I was like, oh my gosh, she's flying. She probably ended up beating me by like an hour and a half. Because I imploded and everything, and that's obviously anecdotal and N of one, but it does just go to show that, like, in the sport of Ironman, there's a lot, or long course triathlon, there's a lot of other factors that play into your ability to perform on race day. And I think, in the scheme of things, weight is pretty low on the totem pole. So we'll leave you guys with that. You can, I think this is a super fun format, answering people's questions and doing those sort of things. So we just want, to let all of you know, like, please reach out to us, whether it's commenting down below, if you're on YouTube, or, reaching out to us via DM on Instagram. You can find me at Critical02. You can find Aaron at Try a Geyser. I'm sure we'll be able to incorporate some more of like his common athlete questions from the coaches, or from the coaching standpoint that he does. And this, like I said, this is really fun. I'm hoping that this turns into a little bit more of a normal thing for us to be able to do. So, Aaron, do you want to leave him with anything else?
If you're on Zwift Saturday morning, we're still there. So
Yep.
8 o'clock Eastern time on Saturday morning in the States. Of course, as we move west, that just backs up to whatever your time zone is. But
Mm-hmm.
I tell you, it's worth the time. It's good training, and it often, like, as I want to say this past weekend was 2.5 hours or 2 hours and 25 minutes. This week is like right around that 2 hours and 30 minutes. It'll continue to build up 15 minutes starting this week. So incrementally build up. But I just give the platform of people asking questions,
Mm-hmm.
and the amount of people that have come into that ride and stayed. I know that the material that I'm providing is good content because people are coming back time and time again. But if you're looking for additional exposure, I'm going to welcome you into that environment. Zwift, it's under Endure IQ, 8 o'clock Eastern in the States. And of course, Zwift, you can translate that time zone to whatever yours is to your local time. But it's worth your time. It's an
Mm-hmm.
aerobic ride. You don't have to be there for the entire time, or you can. It's your call. But Phil, I think that that is one plug that I want to push
Mm-hmm.
because it's a great opportunity to get some exposure, some more exposure to me. And if you have questions that you want answered fairly quick, this is a great environment to take advantage of it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. If you're on Zwift or thinking about doing Zwift, drop into to that long ride on Saturdays. It is at 5 a.m. for me over here on the West Coast. But I'm like, every time you plug it, I like, oh, I should probably do it because it's one of those things where it's more fun to ride with the community, and get that workout in early
I
on a
was gonna say it's
Saturday, and
just
then
more
it's like
fun to ride with me, but if you
that
want
too.
to throw
Yeah,
the
yeah,
community, that's fine too. But
yeah, yeah,
you
yeah,
wouldn't be the only 5 o'clocker that would be
yeah.
on that group. So it's pretty diverse. We have Europe who's in their afternoon, and
Mm-hmm.
you can just be kicking it off with the crows or the roosters in the morning.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, thanks again, everybody, for listening, and we'll catch you guys in the next one if we don't catch you on Zwift first.